All right, so moving on. I think my guess is most of you have heard about sunk costs before, but one thing I think your book does really well is it talks about the difference between fixed costs and sunk costs. A lot of times they're the same thing, but a fixed cost is a cost that does not change with output, like we've talked about. So like rent if you have a restaurant. A sunk cost is a cost that's forever lost after it has been paid. So if we think about the rent from the restaurant, if there's a clause that like you can break the lease and get some money back, that's not a sunk cost. But if that's like you paid for the year, that's it, that would be a sunk cost. So basically, a decision maker should ignore sunk costs to maximize profits or minimize losses. I always think about a book. I have this really hard time putting down a book once I've started it. And so this actually really helps me. I think, oh, I shouldn't quit now. I've already put so much time into it, right? That time is a sunk cost. If I think about the future, that sunk cost should be irrelevant. The same thing with walking out of a movie theater if you're watching a terrible movie. But this example that I have is if a company pays a new recruit $10,000 to join the organization, if the person proves to be unreliable, the $10,000 payment is considered a sunk cost when deciding whether they should fire them. So I think I've mentioned McDonald's is paying a hiring bonus. So imagine if the hiring bonus at McDonald's is like, they pay whatever it is, and then the person's just the worst worker ever. McDonald's shouldn't keep them. Well, I paid them. I should keep them. That's a sunk cost. Don't consider that. I have a few homework questions on sunk costs this week. All right, I'm going to skip this mostly. I mentioned in the last lecture that a cubic production function is really the only one that generates the cost curves we're used to looking at. And so if you're reading the book, you'll see they use this a lot, and that's why. That's all you really need to know. All right, now we're moving from the short run to the long run. If you remember, the short run has fixed costs. The long run does not. So oftentimes, like at the beginning of class, I'll pull up some table like the one we did in the last lecture, and I'll say, is this the short run or the long run? And the students look, how do I know the answer? How do I know the answer? Well, it's the short run because there's a fixed cost. In the long run, there are no fixed costs. So basically, what we can do is we can go from our short run curves to the long run average total cost curve. So in the long run, basically you could build a new factory, you could get more machines, whatever. And a long run cost curve is a curve that defines the minimum average cost of producing alternative levels of output, allowing for optimal selection of both fixed and variable factors of production. So it's like in the long run, if you do everything perfectly, you get the perfect restaurant size, you get the perfect amount of machines, how low can your average cost go? And I actually did draw a long run average cost curve in my development class this week, because one thing, we're going to talk about economies of scale. One criticism of microfinance in developing countries is when you give small loans to entrepreneurs, is if you give a bunch of loans to a bunch of people competing with each other, they get stuck in like a one-person business and they can't realize economies of scale. So I actually just drew this. But what we can see here is we've got three average total cost curves. These are short-run average total cost curves. This is at plant size 0, at plant size 1, and at plant size 2. So you're like this restaurant, and I keep thinking about this restaurant. There's this, I know Jessica's in town, Albano's, which is in downtown Valpo. I'm devastated. I heard they're closing, right? But I read the message, and it seems like they're closing because they're building a bigger restaurant. So if we think about this, the pasta restaurant. Okay, so we've got average total costs, and they decrease and they increase because of spreading fixed costs and diminishing returns, all the stuff we've talked about. But at some point here, it might make sense to move to a bigger restaurant. Okay, so that's what they've decided. They decided it's too costly. Maybe workers are running into each other, whatever. And so they're building a bigger restaurant. And this bigger restaurant allows for lower costs at this level of output. If we were to operate at the tiny restaurant at this level of output, it would be much more costly. Okay? And then at this point, we might go to this average total cost curve, we build an even bigger restaurant. But in this case, we can see the average costs are higher. It's just too big, okay? So this is often called the envelope. So it's an envelope of short run average total cost curve, and it's a long run. So why does the long run average total cost curve decrease and then increase? You cannot say diminishing returns. Diminishing returns is a short run phenomenon. This is like if you double all inputs and you get more than double the output, which is increasing returns to scale. If you just like get everything is bigger restaurant, more tables, more machines, everything. There's a point where the long run average total cost curve decreases the more you produce, and that is called economies of scale. So it's like a bigger factory is better. Then we hit a point where we hit diseconomies of scale, where bigger is just too big. We're going to lose efficiencies. And then, of course, in the middle, we would call this constant returns to scale, and sometimes we call it minimum efficient scale. So this is the way that your book is demonstrating constant returns to scale. So you can see as you get bigger, you're really not giving much up. All right, moving on. All right, so this looks pretty tedious, but I actually really like going through this. This is beyond what your book talks about. So if you think about why would there be economies of scale? Why would having a bigger factory with more workers be better? Number one, labor specialization. So jobs can be divided and subdivided, blah, 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 blah. Oftentimes we talk about Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations. He talks about a pin factory. And if you had this one person cut the metal, do whatever you need to do to make a pin, it can make 20 pins a day. But if the workers specialize, you can make 48,000 pins a day. So bigger factories, you can have like imagine an assembly line or something. Number two, managerial specialization. I often think of my husband with this. He's a manager. He's a graphic designer. He's got a team of, they call it a team. He's got a team of 3, okay? He could probably manage more people without being much less efficient, you know what I mean? So so he's got to spend part of his day actually designing and part of his day managing, and he's like switching between these tasks, and I think that could be an inefficiency. Or a marketing person at a small firm might have to do other things. So like at my husband's old firm, there were only 10 people, so the office manager had to do everything, right? So that's kind of inefficient. Whereas at his firm now, there's like an HR person, and then there's also an office manager or whatever. At that point, I lose interest when he talks about it. So it might be more efficient to have a larger firm. Efficient capital, small firms often can't afford the most efficient equipment. I always think about when we got our wedding invitations done, which was 8 years ago. We went to this letterpress place, and they had a letterpress machine that was like the size of my entire room. And it would be so fast, right? So they could do a big letterpress batch really, really quickly. And I'll never forget it because they were doing Courtney Love's personal stationery. And he showed us, and he said she went through 4 assistants within a month. But like if I was an Etsy shop trying to do letterpress invitations, I'd have a really small, like very inefficient machine to do this. Design and development, advertising, things like this. If you have a larger firm, you can be more efficient with these things. Like a pharmaceutical company can afford to do all this research and migraine medication if it's large, right? But like a small one might not be able to do that. And then why is it problematic to be too big? The classic way of talking about this is the management is not close to the line. So I used to have a friend that worked at McDonald's, and she said that the manager would say, if there's time to lean, there's time to clean. But imagine this, like you're at McDonald's, you're so far away from the people making the profit from you that you're not going to have the same kind of management. It's really hard to manage people that far away. Also, I often think about VELPO, problems of communication or red tape. So we used to have like a paper form if a student wanted to add a major or a minor, and they had to get like 10 signatures and then bring it to the registrar's office, and they often lost it, right? Such a large organization, you run into problems like this. Or, you know, like to get your little student card, I walked over one of my students and we were like, oh, we've moved to another building. Actually, we're not open on this day. Actually, you have to email this person. It was ridiculous. So in the movie Office Space, they talk about the TPS reports. In that clip we watched, he says he has 8 bosses. So that's what I think about. And then the economic word for slacking off is shirking. If you're working for a really large organization, you might just not care as much, right? You're not seeing the profits. It's for someone really far away. So maybe when my husband worked for the 10-person organization, his work maybe seemed more important, whereas the big one, there's a lot of people doing work. I don't know that that's the case, but you could argue that could be the case for people. So then the last thing to think about, why I like covering economies of scale, is you can picture industries with a large economies of scale. So if I was to start producing steel in my house, I would be really, really bad at it, right? There's tremendous economies of scale with steel production, which is why you see these giant factories up in Gary. Or car manufacturing. If I was to, I could probably make a car if I devoted my life to it, you know. It would be very, very costly. Whereas the Ford plant does this all day, right? It's giant. It can do it super well. Then you've got industries with a large section of constant returns to scale. And if you think about bakeries or shoe stores, you can have small bakeries and large bakeries, small shoe stores, large shoe stores, and they're all pretty efficient. And then sometimes you can think about industries with large diseconomies of scale, where it makes more sense to be small. And the only one I could think of today was hairstyling. You don't see like giant barber shops, right? Like you see pretty small hairstyling places. So that's, you know, one thing. This is a really boring part of the semester, I bet especially to high school students. And it's one way to like actually involve them. Can you think of an industry with a large economies of scale? Or a place where you just see small producers, like vaping shops, right? We'll talk about vaping shops with monopolistic competition, but like in Valpo, we see all these tiny vaping shops. There must be diseconomies of scale, right? All right, so that is all I have. We've got our exam next week. I'm going to send some details about that. Congratulations, you made it through probably the hardest part of the material. From here on out, we'll be bringing in the demand side with the costs, and we'll be able to do some cool stuff.